I'm going to be talking about T group, ecstasis, and the experience of group flow. Now those last two parts, ecstasis and group flow, I first heard about them in the book Stealing Fire. And so it just connected a bunch of little dots in my brain between what they were talking about and what I've been doing in T groups, so I kind of put them all together and started leading T groups with that particular theme. And then Consciousness Hacking asked me to come do it for them too, so that's what we're up to tonight. Consciousness hacking was actually featured in the book Stealing Fire, so I just had this like, maybe someday I'll get to go there. So here we are. So what is T group? Essentially, it's the T is just a letter. It's not like the beverage tea or anything like that. It stands for training, although I like to think it stands for truth. It's a small group communication practice that's also like a meditation. We have to come very much into the present moment, and what we practice doing is speaking what's actually true and emergent in the sort of intersubjective reality from moment to moment. So ecstasis is a non-ordinary state of consciousness that, well, it can give us glimpses of our highest potential as human beings. It can connect us powerfully to one another, and it can also give us glimpses of the underlying true nature of existence. And group flow is just one form of ecstasis. There's a lot of different routes to the experience of ecstasis, and they're not all individual. Some of them are collective. And T group is just one version or one technology that is designed to create that collective, non-ordinary state of consciousness. Now, besides being sort of fun, inherently pleasurable and satisfying, it's also revelatory and transformative. And so that's really what we're gathering here to practice tonight and to learn about and to see if we can bring more of that into our experience. And that was when I first learned about consciousness hacking and Mikey Siegel, and I read about ecstasis and group flow, and I was like, oh my God, that's so T group, like connecting the dots in my head. I was like, I have to do something that brings these things together. Maybe someday I'll meet Mikey Siegel, and maybe someday, maybe like 10 years from now, I'll do something with consciousness hacking, but here we are. Yay! Okay, so, all right, so I want to talk just a little bit about ecstasis and group flow and what that has to do with T group, but mostly what that has to do with what we're going to do here tonight. And then I want us to just dive right into practicing, because that's what you're going to get the most out of. Okay, so ecstasis is a non-ordinary state of consciousness that can reveal or like unlock or give us glimpses of our highest potential as human beings. And it can connect us powerfully to one another. And it can also reveal sort of the like underlying metaphysical truths about existence. And so whether we know it or not, all of us have reached for a state of ecstasis. And there's like countless routes to getting there. It could be like a substantial dose of LSD, or just getting super absorbed in creating a terrarium of succulents, or like base jumping into a sinkhole, you know, anything that, well, whatever route you use, it has the same end result, which is down-regulating the networks in the brain that are responsible for generating our experience of being a separate self. Now, we almost never don't have that self, so we take it completely for granted. But this experience of being a bounded, separate, sometimes under threat individual, it's so much like a part of our ongoing experience that when it stops, that's kind of magical. And that's what ecstasis is all about. So collectively, we spend a pretty remarkable amount of time and energy trying to shut off the self. And in his book, The Curse of the Self, Mark Leary writes, forgive me, quote here, "Despite its obvious advantages, our ability to be self-reflective comes at a high price. By allowing people to ruminate about the past or imagine what might happen in the future, self-reflection conjures up a great deal of personal suffering in the form of depression, anxiety, anger, jealousy, and other negative emotions." So when we do manage to power down the self, what happens is that anxious sort of critical voice in the head, it goes quiet. The past and the future kind of dissolve, and the present moment dilates, revealing a high definition, high voltage experience of the now. And it can be so powerfully revelatory and transformative that people talk about it as though it's a peak experience or a spiritual awakening or just one of the most significant events of their entire lives. And it's also inherently pleasurable and satisfying. And it offers up a pretty profound boost to our creativity and our productivity. And so Ecstasis isn't just an experience to be had on your own. Improvisational jazz groups, the Navy SEALs, even Burning Man camps will rely on a state of collective ecstasis to accomplish feats and achieve results that no individual could do on their own. Okay, I have to take a breath. Holy cow, this is hard. Okay, we're back. Tea group is just one of numerous social technologies that can push us into a state of collective ecstasis, also known as group flow. So that's what we're going to be doing today. This is when that separate sense, like hyper self-conscious feature of our human brain powers down, and that sense of being an I sort of expands to that collective sense of we. And that's what T group is particularly good at. So tonight we're going to practice T group 2.0, which is the original form of T group plus all of my updates. And I'm also going to be sharing with you what I've learned over the years, the like necessary ingredients and the specific conditions that really set the stage for group flow to emerge. Because it's actually it's not that easy to generate, and it's quite easy to break. So I'm going to share with you what I've learned to be the most effective sort of context that lets it begin to emerge. I'll share that with you, and then we'll move into the practice. Okay, so let's see here. Wake up. Can you see that? Okay, so this image represents how we usually think of groups. It's a collection of individuals, the dots. And the group will consist of whatever is within the individuals, like their creativity, their intelligence, their connections. Whatever the group is, it's contained in these little dots here. In a group like this, each person will think about and experience him or herself as a separate thing that needs to look out for itself. And in a relatively healthy group, that won't be super part of awareness, but as soon as the group environment becomes threatening, each of those individuals is like, oh, I gotta look out for myself. Okay, and so a different way of thinking about groups is like this. And so although the groups still obviously contain the individuals and whatever the individuals have inside of themselves, this group also represents the connections between the individuals. And the connections themselves are actually like tubes through which communication flows. And communication is just the exchange of energy and information. And in a group like this, the people still experience themselves as individuals, but they also have the experience of belonging to something larger than themselves. And this shifts the attention away from protecting the self, and it shifts the attention onto how can I establish and maintain each one of these tubes and the group as a whole. As you can see, there's individuality, there's like differentiation and distinction, but there's also unity. There's both happening at the same time. It's not one or the other, it's both. And so in a group like this, our attention gets to shift away from that self-consciousness to more of this we consciousness. And that doesn't mean we lose our individuality, we just get to have both. And this is like neurons in the brain. That's another way to think about it. Alone, an individual neuron is not really capable of all that much. And it's just when they combine themselves in the right way that we begin to see the sort of incredible emergent properties and powers of the human brain. This is kind of like that when we combine ourselves in just the right way, we create a unit or an organism that is more powerful, more creative than any of the individuals would be alone. Okay, so this is also a representation of what group flow is, right? If we can create a group like this, that is, by definition, some kind of collective ecstasis or some kind of group flow. This is a visual representation of that sense of collective we. And so to create a group like this, here's what I've learned. Here's the things that groups do to get into and stay in an experience of group flow. They connect all the parts. And the parts are the dots, right? So in our practice tonight, one of the points to remember is to establish a tube or a pipeline of connection with every single other person in your group. And there's only going to be about 5 people per group, so it shouldn't be that hard. But the practice is to is to connect with every single person. Sometimes that's challenging, and that's one reason why it's hard to form groups like this, because there's often obstacles to forming those connections. So we're going to work with that and whatever shows up in that process. And then also, groups in group flow, when they first start to form, this is a really important part here. There's a few models of the stages of group development. So when a group of people first come together and it's a baby group, if they start with appreciative feedback, I'll say a little bit more about what that means. But if they do that, if they come into connection in a safe and gentle and nourishing way, they allow the tubes to really establish, right? If we start off with something challenging, we just contract, right? Because there's a primitive part of our brain that's just scanning for safety, like, are these people friends or foes, right? So if we allow the group to form in that sort of safe and nourishing environment, then that primitive part of our brain can kind of quiet down and we can move on to other things. Otherwise, we're just going to be obsessed with, like, am I safe or not, right? Okay, so they start with appreciative feedback and then they work their way up to differentiating. We don't just stay in the light and love happy land. We let the group form there, because that's what then sets the stage and lets the group come into connection, because that's when it can begin to take on more challenging material. This image is also kind of like the weave of a trampoline, right? If we take time to weave those threads together, then we could put something heavy on top of it, right? Like a trampoline could hold a giant boulder. If a boulder might represent like a major difference or some kind of conflict, you could put that on a trampoline and it could hold it. But if we don't take the time to weave these threads together, it'll be like putting a pebble on a wet paper towel, just fall right through, right? So if we want to create deep and powerful and transformative groups, we need to take the time to connect them up like this. And so that's why we start with the appreciative feedback. Okay, and also groups that get into group flow, the individuals will engage and respond. They will proactively bring themselves and reveal themselves in the group. And when someone speaks to them, they will respond. We don't leave one another hanging. That is, that's like a little, a withdrawal from the group health bank account. Okay, and individuals in these groups also will reveal themselves as fully and honestly as they can. So that's another invitation this evening, is to practice doing that. And then they also speak their withholds, as in we don't leave things in the shadow unspoken, and they repair their ruptures. And this is just when there's those like moments in connection that like, you can't quite tell maybe where exactly it might have come from, but all of a sudden that tube between you, it like contracted or shut down, or maybe there's like a kink in the hose or something. There's something between us, right? So repairing ruptures means, okay, I think there's something in the space between us. Let's see what that is, instead of letting it sort of sink into the unconscious of the group. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to T group. I'm going to pass these out. Okay, can you pass those down? And pass these around as well. Thank you. Okay. So these things, the groups that are in group flow, this sort of list of traits, I suppose. I'm going to leave this up here so that we can sort of reference it in our T group practice, but the green cards that are making their way around, this is what you actually do in the group. And you might do all of these things in the process of doing this, okay? So the first most important frame in T group practice is the 3 levels of communication. So this is pretty simple. The first level of communication is called ritual, and that is sort of the highly scripted bits of communication that we use. Like, hi, how are you? Thanks, I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine, right? They allow us to acknowledge one another and exchange goodwill, but they don't really let us make contact with one another. Level 2 is called exchange, and this is where we're sharing ideas or stories or data or asking questions of one another. And there's more contact that's happening on this level, but the reason that it's still not a full form of contact is because when I'm sharing information with you, part of my awareness and part of my attention has to go to another time and another place, abstractly, to retrieve that information and then come back to share it with you. So even though my eyes might be pointed right at you, my attention has to go somewhere else for a little bit to go get what it is I want to tell you about. And in T group, one way that we talk about it is to stay in the tube. To stay in the tube means I'm fully here in our connection. And if I was to go back onto level 2, I pop out of the tube and I go elsewhere to get this information, and then I come back. And so that's why level 2, there's connection that is happening, but not full connection because we're leaving from time to time to go get other stuff. And so then level 3 is there's no topic, there's no data, no information, no stories being shared whatsoever. We're just in the tube. And the only purpose of the words and speaking is to articulate whatever is happening, either within me or in the connection, the intersubjective space that's right between us. And this is what makes T group like a meditation. It's all about the present moment, body sensations, emotions, the mind's interpretations and stories, and how that generates feelings, and then how that generates stories, and then how that generates feelings. All of this is happening in the present moment, right? So intersubjective meditation is one way to talk about what T group is. Okay, so I think everyone should have a green card by now. So we'll be on the side that says Basic Level 3 Communication Handles. So T group is a practice of level 3 communication, and these are the two most basic forms, right? So at the top of the green card are the simplest things, right? It goes from the simplest to kind of the most complex. And it's just right now I feel or notice. Or hearing that, as in what someone else has said, either to you or someone else, I feel or notice. And this is just a way to, again, engage, bring yourself, reveal yourself at whatever level of depth you're available for in the moment. And then it also is about responding, right? We've got number 3, engage and respond. So both of these two here will accomplish that. Okay, and then the feedback process is just a more elaborate version of those two basic forms. Okay, so the first step here, well, I think what I want to say first is that this process, the feedback process, it takes something that we ordinarily do really fast and without a whole lot of awareness or choice, and it slows it way down. So the first step is to share when you did or said this very specific thing, right? This is not like when you looked confused there. That's my interpretation, right? Confused is my interpretation. It would be when you squeeze your eyes together and turn your head to the side, right? That's specific observable data. That's the cue, right? Then the second step, I made it mean. So when you squeeze your eyes together and turn your head to the side, I made it mean that you might feel confused, right? So the step number 2 is the story I have told or the interpretation I have made about them or about myself. I might say, you know, when you squeeze your eyes together and turn your head to the side, I make it mean that you might feel confused. I also made it mean that maybe I'm not very good at explaining myself, right? So it can be about you or about them. And it's just 1 to 3 sentences because, you know, if we're in the present moment, you don't have that much time to make a really elaborate story, right? So there's sometimes a temptation to go into explaining or elaborating when you're sharing the step, but it really is just a couple of sentences, right? Oh, you did this thing, I made it mean blank. It won't take very long to say. And then step 3, I feel. And there's a really important point here. I'm going to pass something else around. And let's do, I don't think I have one enough for everyone to have one. So let's do one for every pair. So I feel, and the important distinction here is between feelings and stories. So there are a lot of words that we use to describe our feelings that are actually more like stories or interpretations. For example, I feel seen, I feel heard, I feel loved. These are stories about what the other person is doing. And similarly, I feel attacked, I feel judged, I feel belittled. Again, there's still stories about what the other person is doing. If I say, I feel judged right now, what I've actually said is, I believe you are judging me, right? So in T group, we want to just to peel those two apart and put them in their appropriate spots. So we might say, you know, that last thing that you said to me, I made it mean that you're judging me, and I felt nervous and scared, right? Because if we lined up 3 people here and they all were having an experience of feeling judged, this one would feel nervous and scared, this one would feel amused and mischievous, and this one would feel completely bored, right? So if I say I feel judged, I haven't told you how I feel yet. And so in T group, it's important to share, like, what story have you made about it? It's not wrong to have stories, but we just name stories as stories and feelings as feelings. So what you'll see on the feeling wheels that I just passed out is a really great sort of map. If you start in the center, you'll find the simplified version of the feelings, and then if you go outwards from there, you'll find the more specific versions of it. Okay. And so what we ordinarily do out in the world, what this process slows down, is we'll notice a cue in someone else, usually not consciously. We'll make a story about it really quickly. We'll believe that story. And then that story will generate feelings, and then we will assume that they caused those feelings. We'll blame it upon them. This is just basically the process of projection. And so what this process does is that slows that whole thing way down, shows you where you are actually creating your own experience, just to give you choice and more freedom and awareness about it. Because the projection and the blame and the reactivity, this is like the low-lying underlying inflammation that over time gives rise to our entrenched conflict, our disconnection, and the fragmenting of groups. So if we can slow that roll, reel it back in, and take more ownership for what we're doing in our minds and our feelings, when we can offer people feedback in a format like this, it conveys, like, I know that this is mine, but it still might be very useful information for you. And it's something that we need to hash out in the intersubjective space between us, because that's all we have to go on, is our experience. Okay, cool. So, and then, at the bottom of the card, some extra credit things, not necessary, but sometimes they do reveal an additional facet of connection that can be interesting. The impact on our connection, and we've got some examples there: loss or gain of trust, respect, etc., or impulses to explain or reassure or withdraw. The impulses especially, these are the places that I see people getting pulled from level 3 to level 2 most often. So somebody doesn't really understand what you've just said. There's a strong impulse to, like, clarify or explain. Instead of going into clarifying and explaining, what you would say in T group is, wow, I have an overwhelming impulse to clarify or to explain myself right now. And then the invitation is to, like, kind of look more inwards, like, where does that come from? What's going on there that would have you want or need to do that? And then the extra credit, my intention in sharing. And sometimes it's just the most basic one of, like, I'm establishing our tube. That's kind of the implied and implicit. You don't have to say that every time, but sometimes there is a really specific and interesting intention that you're having when you're saying the specific thing that you've got. So you can share that if you want. And then lastly, on the back of the card, you'll see some suggestions about how to engage and respond in those moments where it's hard to engage and respond. So T group does not mean you have to, like, rip yourself open and share all of the things that are going on inside at all times. It doesn't mean that at all. You get to choose the level of depth that you share yourself at in any given moment. And here's just some ways to do that, to sort of titrate, right? It's not just an on-off switch, it's a grade. And so you can say, I want to participate in the group right now, but I actually can't feel what's happening, right? Or I can't find the words. Or I want to acknowledge what you've just said, but I don't know what my response is yet, right? So it sort of, like, brings you to the group, and it completes communication loops even if you don't really know what to say. Okay, let's see here. So we're going to break off into groups now, and I just need to know how many people are here. Do you guys have a count over there? No? 1 minute? Okay, well, while they count, any questions about T group practice itself, like how to do it? Any questions about that? No, I am not.
So we just sort of follow the script. Is there an overall timing? I mean,
how are we going to do this?
Guarantee that we all end at the same time. And some people might put the table down.
Yes. I will offer up the sort of logistics here in a moment.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I will answer that. Maybe we'll do that now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to number off. We're going to get into groups of 5, and we're going to go for about 45 minutes. So somebody in each group will need to offer up their phone as the timer. And the group will start off with So everyone in the group will take about a minute to respond to the sentence stem, my lesson right now is. And this just means like, what chunk of personal growth are you working on right now? It might be something as simple as like, my lesson right now is like consistent and sustainable self-care. Might be something like that. Or it might be like, my lesson right now is learning how to speak to myself in a kinder way. Or my lesson right now is letting go of expectations of how other people should show up, right? So it's like, kind of like, what are you learning in your life right now, in your own process of development? And you can choose, you can share at whatever level of depth you would like. And we go around with that sentence stem, and it is on level 2. It's true. It's going to ask you to go get some information about yourself and share it in the group. But what it kind of does is it just gives the groups a way to begin, right? So we'll go around the group with that. And then when the last person goes, then we just drop right into T group practice. That's when we say, you know, Shelby, when you said that thing about your lesson, I made it mean this, and I felt this, right? And then we're just off. I think you'll see that as soon as we get these groups rolling, there's a lot of stuff to explore. Yeah? Yes. And even though one person at a time can speak, we make use of some hand gestures in T group, and I'll share the kind of the most important one, which is just this. It means like, oh yeah, me too, I'm resonating with what you just said, or I have a version of that. So this is a really, really good one to use. It's a way to engage, even if you're not speaking. Okay, so somebody will start. It goes around the group with the sentence stem. And in the first group, we're gonna focus on appreciative feedback and connecting all the parts, right? So the first group is just about weaving that group together, right? Coming to establishing all of those tubes, but in that environment of nourishing and connective communication. Yeah, it doesn't mean conjure up warmth where there isn't any. It just means let's put our attention on where it genuinely is for this first round and see if we can begin to establish that sort of rainbow star. Or I guess you couldn't see all the colors, but it's meant to be colorful, the star. We'll see how, see if we can begin to put that together in the first round. And then in the second round, we will we'll open up the door for more differentiating feedback. Yep. And then there's another practice that we'll do at the end of that second round. But that's what we're going to do. We're just going to jump right on in and splash around and see what happens. And again, this is not the get it right round. This is the like practice and see what happens round. So please give yourselves leeway to not know how to do it yet if you don't know how to do it, and just practice. We'll see what happens. If that was awkward and uncomfortable, you were doing it right. Nicely done. Thank you so much for just jumping right on in and giving it a try. T group is weird and uncomfortable and awkward just about as often as it is revelatory and powerful and awesome. So thank you for hanging in there if you had some of the crunchier experiences. So before we go to round 2, you're going to go to the same place with the same people. And there's a couple things I want to say before we go to round 2. So round 1 was about connecting all the parts and starting with appreciative feedback and practicing the engage and respond practice. And also reveal yourself inside of that. And so round 2, we're going to invite a bit more of differentiation. And so if appreciative feedback is just when you're sharing with somebody something that they've done or said that has like a ripple effect or a chain reaction that's positive within you, differentiating feedback is when you have a difference with somebody, right? It's a way of reframing conflict. It's not necessarily a conflict. It's just there's a difference between us that we maybe just don't understand fully quite yet. So in round 2, we're going to move, or we're at least going to open the gate to move more towards those places where connection or communication seems to not be happening very well, right? I imagine there was a person for everybody here. There was a person for you in your group that you maybe just didn't click with or didn't connect with very well. And so differentiating feedback is when we kind of lean into those places, conjure up a bit of bravery, and actually speak the truth about what's happening in the space between us. Like, what is preventing us from establishing a tube? Or what's going on in our tube? Is it contracted, or is there a kink in it, or is it not even there, right? T group is also a practice of learning how to be aware of the tubes, right? That's not something we're really taught how to be super aware of in a really individualistic culture like ours. Okay. Speaking with holds is also a practice of differentiating feedback, and then repairing ruptures also is a place where we sort of notice like, oh, our tube isn't doing so hot right now. Let's put some attention on it and see what's going on there. Okay, and so a few other points that's more like fine-tuning our T group practice. One thing I wanted to mention is that in T groups, what I see a lot is that when two people are having a more intense interaction, everyone else in the group will kind of sit back and hold space, thinking that that's like the polite thing to do, or making the assumption that, oh, that's not really about me, so I'm just going to observe. In T group, that's not actually true, because everything that's happening involves and includes and belongs to everyone all the time, right? So when we do this sort of like step back, hold space thing, I call that audience mode. And what nearly everybody does when they go into audience mode is they kind of check out a little bit, like this isn't about me, it's less engaging, and then maybe I'll come back into the group when I feel more plugged in. So I want to invite you, I'm trying not to breathe into this thing, and the result is I can't breathe. So I want to avoid audience mode by reminding yourself that everything that's happening, it includes you, it's about you, it belongs to you, and the ever-present meditation of T group is just what's coming up in me right now as I witness this exchange. And that at any point in time, I mean, obviously not rudely interrupting one another, but whenever there's an opportunity, you can always bring yourself and say, you know, when you said that to her, I made it mean this and I felt this. And it's really that cross-weaving and volleying between all of the group members that really enlivens and enriches and deepens the group. So avoiding audience mode is point number one. And then point number two is there's a few habits of speech that most of us have that T group practice I hope will help sort of untrain. The first one is the phrase makes me, and you might have used this in the first round. It's not a big deal, but I want to invite you to get curious about that point where you say, and that makes me feel, right? If you'll notice, okay, you'll notice on the green card that step number 3 is just I feel. Right? It doesn't say makes me feel, because that phrase makes me implies that somebody else has caused or forced you to have an experience, and that's not entirely accurate. It's more nuanced than that. So we want to avoid using the phrase makes me feel, and instead we just say I feel. And then 2 similar phrases that we also want to untrain, I feel like and I feel that. If you start with that phrase, whatever comes next is probably not a feeling. This is when we say stuff like, I feel like you're being a jerk. Definitely not a feeling, disguising a story as a feeling, right? Or I feel like I'm on a roller coaster, right? That's a beautiful metaphor, but it doesn't tell us how you feel, right? So if you find yourself saying that, no big deal, just follow it up with, okay, so a roller coaster to me is disorienting and terrifying, right? Who knew? And then the last habit of speech that we're sort of untraining in T group is the use of the word because. I can't actually recall a moment where in T group where because was actually stayed within the format of T group. It's usually a segue off into story and explanation. So, okay, so just to recap, makes me feel or do or say this or that. We're kind of like noticing that that's not entirely accurate, so we're just going straight to I feel. And then also I feel like and I feel that and because, okay? And so for round 2, we're gonna go to the same place with the same people, another 45-minute round, but this time, the idea is the first round was just establishing connection, right? Establishing those tubes in between all of the individuals. Yeah, you got it now. Okay, good. And then so in the beginning stages of group formation, it just lets everything go better when we do that in the sort of appreciative, nourishing, safe sort of end of the pool. But now that we've done that, we get to swim into the deeper end of the pool, and we get to lean in more to the places that feel crunchy or disconnected or weird. And in my book, the T stands for truth. Now officially the T stands for training, but I think that the structure on the little cards that I've given you, it gives us a way to say stuff that's really true that we would usually hold back for fear of it causing conflict or fear of being impolite. So I want to encourage you to, in round 2, to use the structure that you've got to say the stuff that's really true. Because when we say it in that sort of self-responsible ownership kind of a way, that's what makes it so much easier to hear. And you might wind up giving somebody a piece of feedback or a reflection that, though it might be challenging for them to hear, winds up being super valuable to them in the long run. I've seen that so many times. Okay, so we'll start in a similar way that we did last time with one sentence stem. And that sentence stem will be, my intention for this round is, and everyone will take about a minute to respond to that. You go around the circle and just let everybody talk. And then when the last person talks, you just drop right back into T group and you go for 45 minutes. And then we'll come back and we'll have our closing experience. We're just waiting for people to come. So yeah, we'll just stand up at the front and use the mic. And I want to make a few announcements about T groups.
Great, yeah, totally.
And then that's it. One final expression of gratitude. Thank you so much for your practice and your bravery and your adventurous spirit. I hope you got something useful out of this practice. So if you could imagine the groups that you were in tonight, if you met with those same people week after week after week after week, you'd get through all the layers and all the things that keep you out of connection with one another. So this really is meant to be a practice done over time. So you got a little bit of a taste of what is possible. And so I want to project that out in the future and have you imagine what that could be if you kept at it. Because what shows up in a T group, even with strangers that you've never met before, it's going to be the same stuff that comes up in your relationships in your life in general. So T group really is that laboratory where you can learn about yourself and make discoveries. And it's also the mirror that can give you the kinds of reflection that we just don't often get in the normal world. So if this is something that you want to do more of, I host a weekly T group gathering every Sunday night in Emeryville. It's super affordable. We've been at it for over a year. It's just the complete highlight of my week, and I'd love to have you join us. And I hope to get a weekly gathering started up in the city as well, so stay tuned for that. And then also some super fun things this Sunday from 6 to 10 in Berkeley. Movement T group number 2. I'm sort of marrying two of my favorite things, embodiment and movement practices, and T group. The idea is that embodiment, connection to self, is what then informs connection to others. So how can we do both at the same time and deepen into both? And then the Sunday after that, December 1st, another flavor of T group speed dating, which is just 6 20-minute T group rounds and a little matching algorithm, and who knows what all kinds of things come from that, so that'll be super fun. And then also, extra connected to tonight's event, the Ecstasis experiments. And you can find out all of this stuff on my website as well, so no need to retain at the moment. But the Ecstasis experiments are something I'm super excited about. So it's going to be just me and 5 other people in a 4 to 5 hour deep dive session where we get to sort of work with some of my more crazy and experimental ideas about what gets groups into states of collective ecstasis and group flow. And they're very much swim at your own risk. So no guarantees on that one, but I'm super excited about it. And I think that's about it. We also have some closed groups starting up really soon. That's where you would get to work actually with the same exact people week after week after week. Some are going to be in person in the East Bay, and some are also going to be online. So there's all the T group all the time, and you can find out about it on my website. And I think Josh was going to lead us in our sort of final announcements and closing.
Here, on your website.
It is Crystallin, CrystallinDillon.com. And then also there's a sign up list at the there you go, right there. I put together a packet for this evening's event. If you want the PDF electronic copies of this card or the feeling wheels, sign up and check off that you'd like the packet. I'll send that to you. And I'm also happy to send you this article. I didn't really talk about the research behind what I was saying, but there's a really amazing article on how LSD in particular operates on the networks in the brain that are at least part of generating that separate self experience. So if you are interested in the research behind all of this stuff, that's in the packet too. Okay.
Will your website have your calendar?
My calendar.
The events you just spoke about?
Yes, it's not a calendar. It's the menu of the website has like all the names of the different events, and you'll just find the dates and the times there. Thank you. Okay, over to you.